Okay, folks, let's talk a little bit about MLA formatting because this is important for us to start to understand this in order to move forward with some of the stuff we've been talking about the last couple days. So let me start up this slideshow. So let's start here with ninth edition MLA style guide. Now, this is the style guide and formatting we use for English courses. So you can see here some boilerplate information. The link to this is in our Canvas shell. Now, what MLA is, and I have never bought this book in my life, mainly because I've actually been handed several of them, and plus there are lots of free resources. But MLA stands for Modern Language Association. It is a style formatting very used by various humanities disciplines, and it covers three main things: document formatting, in-text citations, and works cited lists. So let's talk about those things. Now, they have some things here about the ninth edition. You don't need to worry about those, but this is a basic rule you need to keep in mind. Even though I may say this is how I do it, any professor has the ability to override the guidelines for their classroom. So always allow for your instructor's guidelines to take precedent. So, as you're going to see as we go along here, I am going to tell you about certain things that I tend to favor over other things, and that is because I have certain preferences that I would like you to adhere to. So, first of all, our typical document format is an 8 by 5 by 11-inch piece of paper. That is a standard piece of paper, by the way. We double space everything. You'll see here that it says 12 point Times New Roman or similar font. I'm going to go ahead and put my first preferential card down and say I want it 12 point Times New Roman font only. Okay? We leave only one space after all punctuation, whether it be comma, semicolon, or period, and we set our margins at 1 inch. Now, and it says here to indent the first slide of paragraph 1/2 inch. That usually just means hits tab. Now, most of this stuff will be done for you because I tend to use templates for this. And if you use the templates that I'm going to give you for your assignments, most of this is already preset for you. So I recommend that you utilize those things in those situations. Now, I do not require header, but those usually appear in the top upper right-hand corner, and that is different than a heading we talked about here. And if something is what's considered a container, such as a book, a movie, it is in italics. And if the quotation marks for the sources that are contained within containers, such as books within a chapter, songs on an album, we'll see that as we go along here. Don't worry about endnotes. We won't necessarily be dealing with those. But when we talk about the first page in MLA, we don't have a title page like APA. We tend to double space everything. We typically start with our heading, which is down here, where we list your name, the instructor's name, the course name, and the date. Again, in the upper left-hand corner, I tend to list your name, the course, then the instructor and date. Either way is fine, but these go in the left-hand corner, and these are also preset for you in our templates. We center the title, no underlying bold or anything like that. We create a header. You do not have to. And it looks something like this. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, the Doe one, that is the header. The left-hand side, Jane P. Doe, Professor Patricia Sullivan, English 624, 12th of February, that's the heading. Then towards a recovery of the 19th century farming handbooks. That is our title, drop down, and we simply indent and start our first paragraph. The only thing that you will see different on most of our assignments is that we will have subheadings, so there will perhaps be a subheading between the title and where we start typing, but that's about mostly what it does. If you have experience with APA, this will look slightly different, of course. Now, when we talk about section headings and talking about subheadings here, you will notice that there are two types. There is a numbered one and then there is a bold one. You will notice when you look at any of my sample templates that we're going to be using the bold version. So I do have a preference there as well. Yeah, don't worry about that one. So let's talk about in-text. That covers our document formatting, which is fine. Now, for our in-text citations, what we're doing here, an in-text citation will be in parentheses, and it's typically meant to be a brief reference in your text that indicates the source you consulted. Now, the full information is something we find in the Works Cited page, but the in-text citation has certain rules. It should direct readers, of course, to that Works Cited list source. That's what it's there for. It's there to cite the source in the paper and then direct you to the full information at the end. It is also meant to be unobtrusive. Now, this is important to keep in mind because the unobtrusive means it's not there to get in the way. It's not there or should not be there in a way that gets in the way of someone reading your paper. It is meant to be short. We try to make it as short as possible without losing the ability to connect it to the end document we're dealing with. Provide the citation information without interrupting your text. And in general, the in-text citation will be typically an author's last name or an abbreviated title with a page number if that is there or not enclosed in parentheses. So let's look at some examples. So let's look at this one here. We have this one. Part of Nicholson's hope was realized in 1837 when Michigan established their state university, specifying that, now notice the quotes here. The quotes are going to flow. If I read this without indicating the quotations, you would never know. But the idea of integrating a quotation here is that it should naturally flow. The only way I know where your words stop in a short quotation like this and the other person's words begin are the quotation marks. So specifying that agriculture was to be an integral part of the curriculum. Now you'll notice immediately after here what's circled. Notice at the end of curriculum, there is no punctuation. Even if there was punctuation there, you would remove it. Then we have the closing quotations, open parentheses, Danhoff, space 71. We don't have page or a comma, close parentheses, period. Now, I want to emphasize the importance of this, and this is repeated below again. What makes this important here, this method I'm saying here about no punctuation, if I put punctuation after curriculum and then after the citation, I have literally made that its own sentence. Okay? This is all about period being the full stop of an idea. If I put the period before with curriculum, but not after Danhoff, I have basically told you that the Danhoff 71 belongs to the other sentence. So to make sure that proper attribution is given to the right source, we want to make sure that we save punctuation till afterwards to make sure it is maintained and included. Now, these can take us several different ways, by the way, before I move on here. If, for example, if I'd used Danhoff earlier in the introduction to the quotation, I could have simply put the page number here. There are a couple of variations, but this is the most common one. And if you didn't have a page number, it would simply be a last name in this case here. This is when we have author's last name and page numbers. Now, when we're citing sources in books and journal articles, you can use signal phrase. This is what I was just hinting at here. So let's look at this example here. In his 1825 book, Nature and the Reason of Harmonized in the Practice of Husbandry, John Lorraine, that's our author, begins his first chapter by stating that, quote, very erroneous theories have been propagated, close quote, resulting in faculty farming methods. Now, notice at the end here, in parentheses, we only contain the page number. That is still a legitimate citation method because we used the author's name earlier on. We do not have to use it again here in this situation because we've already used him as part of the setup, all right, for the sources. So this example here uses both the book title and the author's name as signals. You could actually literally just use the author's name as well as a setup as well. But these are when we're using those subject pieces to help establish the introduction or lead in to a quotation. Now, what if we have a situation where we do not have a given author? This typically happens or will happen in some cases of online sources. It will also happen if you are referencing a term from the dictionary or a term from an encyclopedia. These kind of things happen. So what ends up happening in the order of operations, a works cited entry would have an author's name. The next thing over is the title of something. And in this case, that's what we're using here. Because there is no author, the title moves over. And so in this situation here, we have abbreviated, we have integrated the quotations again, all right? And instead of having an author's last name, since there isn't one, we have presented an abbreviated title. Now, we don't want to shorten it too much. I remember the original here was its original title was The Impact of Global Warming in North America. What we have done in this case here is we've dropped the prepositional phrase in North America and we have simply listed as the impact of global warming. We have kept the quotation marks indicating that it is an article. And if I went to the works cited page, I'd be able to use the impact of global warming to probably find it. Granted, the title might be longer there, but again, this is part of that rule about trying to avoid being obtrusive or getting in the way of our reading. So we've got to make sure we limit the nature of these when we can. All right. Also, another example here is in some situations where we have two or more works by the same author and the same title, more information is sometimes needed to clearly reference a specific item on our works cited square brackets. This is an example here where we have included in the brackets, which means we have edited something. We have edited probably what Lip I think is an editor into this to distinguish which version we're using because we're talking about Milton Paradise Lost, and we this time have included a very specific editor. I do not imagine we will encounter this situation ourselves. This situation and these situations right here are far more likely. All right, other kinds of index citations we should worry about. Now, not all these are something we're going to immediately encounter, but it's worth noting here. And this is a very simple one. If you happen to have two or more sources that happen to have authors who have the same last name, but they are not the same person, we simply add their first initial. So you see R. Miller here, A. Miller. In this situation here, these are not the same author, obviously, but to make sure we draw a clear distinction, makes common sense. We just simply use the first initial. Now, if we have multiple authors, there are some rules that is worth taking note of. This will become something of potential use to us when we deal with our first essay, because since we are going to be analyzing a comic book, and a comic book tends to have at minimum two authors. So if we go all the way to the bottom, a 2016 study suggested stricter gun control in the United States will significantly prevent accidental shootings. Now, this is obviously something we're paraphrasing or summarizing. You don't see direct quotations. But notice how we frame the parentheses here. Strong and Ellis. Those are the last names of our two authors. For example, if we have one of the comic books, we might have, let's say, if I was quoting from Kingdom Come by Mark Waid and Alex Ross. Wade and Ross would be my last names I would include there. However, in some situations, and this can happen in comic books, there can be more than one writer or more than one artist. In that situation, this is where we have this ETAL period become important. So, for example, below here, you'll see Smith et al. Argues tougher gun control is not needed in the United States, or the authors state that the tighter gun control in the United States erodes Second Amendment's right. Smith et al. Period 76. Now, what we're targeting here for the audience is that there's potentially three or more authors. And rather than listing all their last names, you see that we list the last names if there are two of them. But rather than list the names of all three of them, it is in our best interest, again, not to be obtrusive, we shrink it and we use the last name of the first author who appears. So in this case, Smith, the ETAL stands in for all the other authors, however many there are. Obviously, in this case, there are at least two more, maybe many more. But this is our way of getting around that rule about getting in the way so that what we don't want to do is end up not only reading what's on the paper, but reading the source itself. We really want to try and tighten it up as much as we can when we can. Not something I necessarily think what will happen, but if it does happen with one of our comic books, we'll talk more about it then. Multiple works by the same author. So this is an example here. You'll see this gentleman Leitner has argued, and you'll notice that there are two different citations, quotations too soon and quotation marks hand-eye development. Those are two works by that same author. We have used him as the signal phrase or the introductory to this sentence, but we need to indicate that we are quoting, or in this case, summarizing something from two different sources by him. Again, not a problem I think we're going to come across in this class per se, but it's worth noting there. That's how you make the distinction so that you don't run into the problem of, if I just put the author's last name, but I've got three sources by that same author in my works cited page, how do I distinguish which source is thing? This is how you do it. You use the author's last name as the signal phrase to introduce it, and then in the in-text citation, you use the title, abbreviated title of whatever article it is. All right. Multi-volume work. Not going to worry about this, but I do like citing this one because it's a fun one. It's okay. Talking about citing the Bible. And by the way, this has nothing to do with secular or religious, but I want to point this out because this is a issue of translation. So, for example, it says here in our in-text example, Ezekiel saw, quote, what seemed to be four living creatures, close quote, each with the faces of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. In parentheses, it says New Jerusalem Bible, comma, Ezek, which is abbreviated for Ezekiel, period, 1:5-10. Now, that's our chapter and verse. But why don't I say God? And again, not a religious thing. But the answer is if you look up Bible translations, there are hundreds of them. And because if you remember back to when I was talking about this, when we talked about logos, pathos, and ethos, a lot of them were written in Aramaic and in Greek. Guess what? They don't have direct English translations, so that when people translate these things, there is a chance that the words shift. And I'll give you an example. Second Corinthians in the Bible talks about faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. That's the New Revised Standard Version. If you look at the King James Version, it's faith, hope, and charity. Different translation, different word. Same attempted meaning. They use the word charity rather than love because of the translation. So that is why we have to use the translation. If we show something from the Bible, we want to make sure we indicate which Bible so that we make sure that we direct our audience if they were to say wanted to read more about what we quoted or check us, they would go to the right place and find the right translation. All right. Now, this is a rare one here, but citing indirect sources. You'll see here it says Radovich argues that high schools are pressured to act as, quote, social service centers, and they don't do that well. Parentheses, QTD, period, in Weissman 259, close parentheses, period. Now, what this is saying here is that in this situation, we are quoting Radovich, but for some reason were unable to get our hands on Radovich. Instead, we found it quoted in Weissman. That's what the QTD stands for. We found it somewhere else, and because we could not find the original, to make sure that we give correct attribution, we have allowed ourselves to quote or indicate that we quoted it from a different source. We were quoting Radovich, but we could not find, maybe it's out of print. Radovich's original work, so we quoted it in another work that we were able to find it in. Okay. And then, of course, below that, we have examples of multiple citations. For example, here you will see in the course here, Romeo and Juliet presents opposition between two worlds, quote, the world of the everyday and the world of romance. Although two lovers are part of the world of romance, their language of love nevertheless becomes fully responsive to the tang of actuality. This is from Zender, and we were quoting him from two different places, so you'll see 138, 141. That attributes to the two different quotes we included in there. Just a way of keeping it short and simple. Now, I want to point this out. So if we are citing multimedia sources, particularly time-based sources, such as this, you'll see here Buffy's promise that, quote, there's no going to be any incidents like at my old high school, quote, is obviously not one on which she can fully follow through. And in parentheses, hush, 00:03:16-7. That's a timestamp. And that comes from below the work cited, Hush, the episode from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, created by Joss Whedon, performance by Sarah Michelle Gellar, season 4, episode 10, Mutant Enemy is the publisher, 1999. Now, I'm going to tell you this right now. This is another one of my prerogatives. I don't believe in making you give me a timestamp. You could literally just write hush for this and we'll be fine. The reason why we have the timestamp ability is because of things like Netflix and Hulu and Amazon, where we can pause things and DVDs. I don't necessarily care for it. So for me, you do not need to worry about that if that become a situation where we do quote a television show, or an episode from a television show in this case, I will not ask you to provide me with a timestamp as well. So something I'll let you off the hook for. And this is just a case here where we have something where there are no page numbers. We simply put the last name. All right. Very similar to what we're doing. If we don't have page numbers, we just put last name. That's what we do. And if we were summarizing something that covered vast places, we would also put last name. But we'll talk more about that later. Now, what we've been looking at up until this point is what we call short quotations in prose. So this is where the idea of integrating. So if you look at the two examples below, it says, according to Falk's study, comma, dreams may express, quote, profound aspects of personality, close quote, 184. If you look below that, it's the exact same quote, except we did not use the author's name as the introduction or the signal phrase, and we simply put it in the works cited. Both of those are correct. Both of those are how we handle short quotations, which means quotations that do not go over 3 lines. If we end up quoting something really big, we have to do this. Sorry, 4 lines. Once we have more than 4 lines of prose, we end up in a situation like this. This is what we call long quotations, or I sometimes refer to it as a block quotation. And I want to point out some differences here, because as you're going to note here, the reason I call it a block quotation is it's shifted over in its own formatting. Rather than directly integrating it, we don't have quotation marks. We literally separate it from the thing. So it says here, Nellie Dean treats Heathcliff poorly and dehumanizes him throughout her narration, colon. Then here is her duration. Because we have offset it, we don't need the quotation marks. We know it's somebody else's quote. And you'll notice at the bottom, the punctuation and then the citation. We don't have to worry about putting the punctuation after the citation, because the next line of you saying anything, you're literally going to drop down to the next line and start right there where it says note that the parenthetical citation comes after the closing punctuation mark. Right there is where you would start typing your explanation to connect the quote. You would literally offset it completely by itself. And because we do that, we don't have to worry about those rules about where the punctuation goes or the need for quotation marks. It is literally offset by itself, and therefore that accomplishes that distinction. Now, if we're dealing with poetry, we do something looking like this. So, for example, Properzia Rossi tells the statue that in the container of her feelings, quote, the bright work grows / beneath my hand, unfolding as a rose, close quote. Lines 31 through 32. That / is a line break. If I have the double slash, that is used when there's a stanza break and there's a moving between stanzas, which we can see here in the second example here. But once we go past 3 lines, we do exactly like we do with the block quotation, and we would leave it in its formatted way. So we don't have to indicate the line breaks with a / or stanza break. We would literally keep it like this if we are going past 4 lines of poetry. And same thing we would have done with prose. We would simply keep it in its format here. So these are just two distinctions, and they do parallel each other. Now, as we've been going through this, you've been seeing some brackets and these little dot ellipses. They are there, and they are at our disposal for some useful things. First of all, I want to read this first one to you. I am going to leave out the brackets. Jan Harold Brennevan, comma, in an essay on urban legend states that, quote, some individuals make a point of learning every rumor or tale, close quote, 78, period. Now, wherever this was in the original text, it was probably pretty clear who those some individuals were. The brackets are, in this case, the author who is using the quote has indicated they have put something in here. Some individuals, brackets, who retell urban legends, close brackets. The brackets allow you to modify a quotation. It lets the audience know that you've done so, and usually you do it for a couple of purposes. You can use it if you need to change something, like add a D or an ED to the end, or an ING to make something fit the text, the context of your text. You can do things like that. Or way back here, if you caught it, I'm trying to remember where is it? Right here. Very erroneous theories have been propagated. Now, this is probably a misspelling, perhaps on the vernacular of the time. They put the V back in to make sure that you understood that was an old school abbreviation for very, so that we would read it more clearly in English. Same thing. Brackets allow for us to make modifications when necessary to help create better understanding or make sure that there is clarity in a quotation. So that is why. So Jan Harold Bunevant in an essay on urban legends states that some individuals who retell urban legends make a point of learning every rumor or tale. That was the who retell urban legends was not in the original quote. It was probably somewhere in the context of the original text. They inserted it to make sure you were not confused by who some individuals were. Now let's look at this exact same one, but we're this time we're going to use the ellipses. All right? Ellipses mean that we've cut something out and we've skipped ahead. Still has to make sense though. In an essay on urban legends, Jan Harrelbin notes that some individuals make a point of learning every rumor or tale, and in a short time, a lively exchange of details occurs. Notice how that still works as a sentence, but that ellipses there tells me that you or whoever was quoting here cut out a word, cut out a couple of words, cut out a sentence, maybe even half a paragraph. But it is indicating to us that something from the original was cut. However, even though it was cut, when we put it together like this, it still makes sense. So if you do cut out something, it still has to flow very naturally like a sentence. Otherwise, it just defeats the purpose. Okay. Now, let's talk about works cited pages. Now, these are typically going to end. So, whenever you end your essay, say it ends on page 4, starting at the top of page 5 on its own page, this is where you would list the works cited page. You will see something very similar laid out in the template for essay 1. But let's talk about what we do going through some of this so we can start to at least think about these things, even though we will not encounter all these things yet. So, it begins on its own page, and this is where we spell out all the sources we've been in-text citing for the purposes of, avoiding plagiarism. This is where they can take the in-text citation, go to the works cited, find the full information, and then if they wanted to, they could go find the full source if they really wanted to read more, check your work if they wanted to. But it's like a chain of providence. It's a way of showing them you read that text, here's the works cited, here's the in-text. It's an analog way of hyperlinking in a way, where you are leading the audience to make sure that you create kind of a paper trail from whatever original source you got the information from. You created a works cited entry for it, and then once you had the works cited entry, specifically when you use specific information from somewhere inside the source, you created those in-text citations along the way. It's a paper trail. All right. We typically list these in alphabetical order with an author's last name. All right. And the page number, if we need if those things, we'll have more than just that. You can see some of this. We will double space all references. We will order them alphabetically. And once we have set them up, you'll notice here, the first line will touch the left-hand margin. All lines after that, we will indent, and that's for readability. Because if I'm scanning through here and I'm looking for, say, Hurt R. Douglas, it makes it easier for me to scan down and find the source if that indentation is there. It's there about readability and accessibility. All right. So here are the number of things we look for when we look for sources. However, most sources don't have all of these, but this is the order in which they would appear. So obviously, when we are trying to put a works cited entry together, most sources we're going to have an author, number one. And so therefore the author is going to go first. We will then have a title of the source, potentially a supplemental element if there is one, followed by a title of a container, contributors, version, number, publisher, publication date, location. These are the order in which they would appear when you're creating your works cited entry too. Now, for a comic book, I will tell you this right now. There will be authors, there will be a title of the source, there will not be a title of a container, contributors, version, number. There will be a publisher, and there will be a publication date, which will be a year. So we will be using 1, 2, 7, and 8. And you can skip over. Like I said, you will rarely use all of these, but this is the order in which they appear. And if you get into things like scholarly journals and things of that nature, you'll find more of these. So let's look at some examples. Starting with the author. So this is our thing that comes first. And of course, obviously, we flip the author, at least the first author's name. So we have Jacob, Allen. In this case, The Pleasures of Reading in the Age of Distraction, period, Oxford, UP, 2011. That's a book. We will do the same thing very similar for our comic book, except we'll have two authors up there, but we will only flip the name of the first for the alphabetical purposes. And then, of course, we have Baron, Naomi S. Redefining reading, the impact in the digital communication media, close quote, PMLA, volume 128, number 1, January 2013, pp 193 to 200. That is a journal article is what that is. But think more about that first one because we're not going to have to necessarily deal with a lot of these more complex ones, but we want to talk about and show where the element of the author appears. And in some cases, later on, there may be a situation where we do have an article online where we don't have an author, and therefore the article would move over to the left. Like one in the bed, and the little one said roll over, and they fell out of the bed. That's the whole thing. Talking about the title of the source, all right? If it's from a periodical, if it's a book or a website or something like that, it will be in italics. It's like if it's like a song or a newspaper or a journal article, a television show, it'll go in quotation marks. So we have a couple examples. We have Lynette, comma Maureen Tova, Modernism, Feminism, and Jewishness. That's a book. Beyonce, period. Quotation marks. Pretty Hurts from Beyonce. That's a song on an album. All right. And then Goldman, comma, and Questions of Transport, reading Primo Levi, reading Dante, the Georgia Review, Volume 64, another journal article publication there. But just so you can see the different types there. In the case of a comic book, we're going to have italics. Okay. We're going to look more like that top one, is what we will end up with. Then, if it has a container, and this oftentimes happens in situations where we do have episodes and we have from a TV show or we have a song on an album. For example, this Pretty Hurts, the container is Beyonce, the album. All right. In this case here, we have Towards Me, the Future of the Book. This is a article or essay inside of a bigger compilation or anthology. The next one there is Under the Gun. Pretty Liars is the name of the TV show. Therefore, it is the container for the episode Under the Gun. All right. Hopefully everybody's with me so far. If this gets any time gets confusing, don't worry. We kind of can hammer these things out as we go along as it's needed. Right now, I just want to give everybody a very general overview. Um, and we talk here a little bit about title of container. So there's a journal, a magazine, a newspaper. It's contained inside of an article. An anthology would contain things like essay, poems, stories. A blog would contain a blog post. Twitter would tweet or post x.com. Website like Facebook, post or comment. SoundCloud album would have a song. So these are the containers and the things they contain. So you can see sort of a list here. A TV series, podcast, individual episodes, things like that. So you can sort of see the connection here. An art exhibit, a specific piece of art. All right. App with the Bible Gateway, version of the Bible, all these things. These are all examples of container and things that get contained inside of them. Now, sometimes, in addition to authors, we have contributors. So we have, in this case here, a translator for our first one. The next one, we have a director, and then we have an annotated introduction. So for this first one here, we have a book. This one in particular was apparently not written in English originally because you can see here that before we move on to the publisher and anything else like this and the year, translated by Lydia G. Cochrane. That is our translator for Roger Cartier. Or, for example, Star Wars The Last Jedi, in this case, Adam Driver, Carrie Fisher, all the people who starred in, of course, the director Rain Johnson, they are the contributors. And then Virginia Woolf, Jacob's Room, annotated with an introduction by Vera Nervo, whatever. We have contributors. These can be editors, directors, performers, translators. These can be sometimes applied. This is something you will probably have more about later on. All right. Then we have a discussion about version. This goes into what we were saying earlier when we talked about the Bible. The Bible, the authorized King James Version. All right. Or in the other case here, we have seventh edition, which means something's gone through several publications. Or in the last case of the last one, Blade Runner, the director's cut. That is the version of something. All right, something that has, and then you can even see here that we have some formulation for ED for edition and revised RV, REV. These are little abbreviations for us to use as well. And then from time to time, we have numbers. This is mainly a scholarly journal thing or a TV episode thing. You can see here, volume 12, issue number 1. We see here for the Iowa Journal of Cultural Studies. We have season 4, episode 10 for this episode of Hush. And then below we have volume 5 of A History of Modern Criticism, 1750 to 1950, volume 5, which means it's part of a series of volumes. So different things of that nature. One thing that I do want to point out here that we've seen a couple of these, if you see this Yale UP or Oxford UP, that is itself an abbreviation. Oxford UP is Oxford University Press. Yale University Press. We do get to abbreviate some things in terms of publishers. Most of what we'll be dealing with will be Image Comics, Marvel Comics, DC Comics for now. All right, so you don't have to worry about that as much. Of course, this ties into the publisher. So you'll see here the abbreviation Oxford UP, the Oxford University Press, or in this case, Carnegie Museum of Art. Okay. And then we have, of course, publication date. Now, this is something we need to pay attention to because for us, it's going to be the year of publication. And we'll talk about this next week. We'll talk about the year of publication specifically as we go through. For example, with things such as here, for example, spring 2008, for us, it's going to be a year, the year that particular comic book came out. In this case, 1999, followed by a period. That's something we do care about. Location is something we'll come about more about later. If we deal with online sources or sources that are contained inside of a larger source. You see PP 74 9-94, that's page numbers. Or this DOI, which is a direct link URL to it. And we sometimes use URL. We can go so far as to use other things like years. We don't necessarily use anymore the city of some publisher. We don't typically use a lot of these anymore, or we use the URL and the access date. These are become more of an optional thing. All right, I'm going to skip this annotated bibliography because we're not doing that. All right. So hopefully that has been useful. So that will help us begin to familiarize ourselves with some MLA. But remember, for the comic books that we're going to be doing, we're going to be more concerned with finding, obviously, our authors, the title of the book itself, and the page number, if there is one, followed by the publisher and the year of publication. Those are going to be the important things that we will be dealing with going forward. All right. I'll see you back in class.